As much as I like it where something that doesn't directly involve me goes wrong because Schadenfreude is so damn addictive, I think there's a line that can be crossed where it stops being funny anymore. Someone falls over, it's funny, as long as they didn't suffer too badly from injuries.
Failure always takes on a darker tone when it comes with consequences. After all, in a market this erratic and unpredictable, it can be very hard to stay ahead of the curve or to keep on top of current trends. Being left behind is a horrible feeling because you wonder if more couldn't have been done on your end to keep up. Like all these YouTube channels who like using clickbait thumbnails. You guys ready for boobs in every thumbnail? I bet you aren't. So what counts as a dying franchise then? Well, I don't really know. How long's a piece of string? How shiny should an apple be before you eat it? I'd say a dying franchise is characterized by either creative or financial stagnation, where the creative team behind it are fast running out of ideas and people aren't buying it in the same vast quantities as before. Sometimes you need to start again with a clean slate that salvages a sinking ship and points it in the right direction. Get used to these metaphors. With a topic like this, they're fucking everywhere in this video. A good sweat cures all diseases. I've said it once before and I'll say it again, I miss platformers. Yeah, they're still making them and Yooka-Laylee takes a chisel to my stone heart, but it's a genre that isn't in as much demand as it was before. It just comes with the territory really, you can't define it as a period where platforms were popular if they didn't die away afterwards, which ultimately leads to a relative undersaturation in comparison to other trends like shooters and open world games. Some franchises saw it coming and jumped ship when they could. Metroid switched to a first-person shooter adventure series, Jak and Daxter dropped it for fast cars and loud guns, and Rayman, a fate worse than death, really.
This is as good a point as any to underline my position on the Rayman series before the Rabbids turned up, and while I didn't grow up with the original games, I did go back in my own time and find them and love them. I think the Rabbids have their own place in the mix, but at the expense of the classic platformers? Not so sure about that.
Reminds me a lot of Spyro and Skylanders. You warp an existing IP into something inoffensive and easy to market, but at the same time you're tearing out the soul of something so pure to do it. Poor Spyro has been lost to the Skylanders empire, and as long as that franchise continues to print money, there won't be any escape. Rayman got out when higher-ups realized that they didn't need him to sell the Rabbids games. And what's the first thing you do when you get out? You make a new Rayman platformer, that's what, the first in 8 years since Rayman 3, and a game that really does show the talent available at Ubisoft if they want to use it for something that isn't dancing rabbits. Ultimately, Rayman Origins isn't that complicated a game, but the level design has so much variety to it that you don't notice that a lot of stages go through the same basic template. Platformers may not be as popular as they once were, which might explain why Rayman Origins didn't sell at all well, but clearly Ubisoft had some faith in the franchise because we got Rayman Legends just 2 years later, which is also 2D and critically acclaimed and capable of giving me the big penis. Now all we need to do is reconstruct what's left of Rayman 4 and we can have a proper 3D Rayman game to drool over. Can't leave it all to Mario Odyssey and Yooka-Laylee to fly the flag. We all need more Rayman in our lives. Can a game be considered a saviour to a franchise if that same series then went and stuck a lit stick of dynamite up its own arse just to see what would happen? Yeah, probably. It's a bit of a weird way of phrasing it though. Just because a franchise is saved doesn't mean that it won't get into trouble soon after. I think it's called the Lois Lane philosophy. You might think, oh, people tried so hard to get it out of such a deep hole, but sometimes you fall back down into the hole trying to make sure that you never have to climb out ever again. I told you there'll be a lot of metaphors here, but let's just say that Sonic games come in cycles. A bit like Ice Ages, the phenomenon, not the films. The films are very close together, you see. In a way, Sonic 06 and Sonic Boom are like apocalyptic events. They come around every once in a while, destroy everything you hold dear, but give you a perfectly clean slate on which to rebuild things. So whenever Sonic starts gaining a bit of momentum, yeah, let's just launch an asteroid scientist later called S06 and see what we end up with. Who else is going to do this research? And yet from the smouldering ashes came Sonic Colors, giving the world a timely reminder that Sonic doesn't have to be a walking joke that lurches from inexplicable glitches to bestiality, by keeping things simple, intuitive, and rewarding, with the rules of the game being outlined at the start and with it rarely straying away from it. But hang on, you might be thinking, didn't Sonic Unleashed come out before Sonic Colors? That was a pretty good game, right? Well, yeah, it was alright, but half of that game did something completely different, and regardless of whether you like the Werehog stages, you can't deny that they divided the fanbase and didn't fix everything in quite the same way as Colors did. It's a comforting game to play, really. Not the greatest plot ever stuck in a game, but the writing's pretty decent and Sonic doesn't make me want to tear my ears off, so a big improvement there. If only Sega would learn to reinforce their strengths instead of doing something new with every game. Then we wouldn't need these asteroids.
Since I'm not much of a Sonic fan, I can take a little bit of joy out of playing games like Sonic 06 and Sonic Boom, since you can witness something awful without feeling too badly about it. Despite this, I still would like it if Sonic could pick itself up with Mania and Project Sonic this year. It's a bit like coming out of an ice age, you gotta start small and build up from there. Sonic may rise again.
A franchise usually finds itself in a position of stagnation as it struggles to adapt to the changing times. It's the toss-up between being proactive and reactive, the trend-setter or trend follower. In the time it takes to get with the program, a series might find itself up shit creek without a paddle and looking around desperately for some kind of way of revitalizing itself. The early Resident Evil games may be the kind of cleverly stupid games that characterized gaming in the late 90s, but they also weren't very viable long-term. I'd argue that they're games that everyone should play if just to observe how you can use camera angles and a control scheme to make the player feel vulnerable enough for tension levels to stay high most of the time, but all this flowery crap doesn't ship copies. The final straw came after a remake of the first Resident Evil game for the GameCube sold a fraction of what Capcom would have liked, and it's a really good game, but not all that mass marketable. I mean, we've got the camp, what more do you want? Zombies, more zombies, but if you could make them Spanish and not actually zombies, that'd be cool. I often think that Resident Evil 4 was a ballsy move that took risks by changing up the formula so dramatically and giving the maladies that the series was suffering from a kill or cure solution, but really, it's not that much different. Yeah, there aren't any more fixed camera angles, but you've still got tank controls, you've still got abstract puzzle solving, and for large parts of Resident Evil 4, mostly the scenes in and around the village, you've still got a lot of horror. Critically, what Capcom did with Resident Evil 4 was make it into more of a conventional video game. You still need to keep an eye on your ammo and health, but not in the same way as horror games that ask you to fight off waves of enemies with a handful of bullets. The tension dissipates towards the end of Resi 4, but at this stage you've got a game that can be a template for future Resident Evil games, as well as future third-person action shooty games. Capcom probably did more for other companies than they did for themselves, but they still turned around their fortunes with one of the best games of all time. Not bad for a GameCube game!
It's amazing to think that even the biggest franchises had a period of uncertainty in their history, where a decision has to be made there and then, and if they come to the wrong conclusion, then we don't get some of the most important games from the last decade. It's hard to imagine Call of Duty in a crisis.
Hey, it happens to the best of us, and it definitely happens to a series that wants to make itself as popular among the masses as physically possible. Call of Duty up until the release of the third game in 2006 was hardcore struggling for an identity. Between Medal of Honor, Day of Defeat, maybe some Deadly Dozen just to make sure, Call of Duty wasn't really giving gamers something they couldn't get elsewhere. There was very little to keep attention focused on this one franchise above any others, and something, fucking anything had to be done, and Infinity Ward had a plan. After they churned out Call of Duty 2, they gave the third game to Treyarch, which gave Infinity Ward enough time and resources to put their efforts towards a complete overhaul of the series and a shift away from World War II combat and towards a more modern style of warfare. The results speak for themselves. Call of Duty 4 dragged a struggling, stagnating franchise out of the shadow of its biggest competitors and gave it a chance to reinvent itself in a completely different setting. The World War II well was dry as a bone at this stage, and so tapping into a setting that was, at the time, not brilliantly represented in the gaming market brought unprecedented success for the Call of Duty name. Hard to believe that a franchise that was once struggling to keep itself afloat is now only behind Mario, Sonic, and Pokemon for all-time sales. And those first two had quite the head start. Comparing it back to Medal of Honor, Call of Duty has bounced from one critically acclaimed title to the next, while the last Medal of Honor game that came out was in 2012 and was pretty average. It also wasn't a World War II game, so clearly Call of Duty made the right move. But with the sales of the latest Call of Duty game down by nearly 50% having made the transition to futuristic warfare, might we see another change? I mean, maybe? Honestly, it's nice not knowing. Keeps you on your toes. There's a lot of fun to be had in enjoying obscure franchises. Yeah, there's probably not much of a guarantee of a sequel, but you can take some satisfaction in the fact that you're experiencing something that isn't wildly popular. I guess it's just that part in all of us that really enjoys being hipsters and saying that this indie game that no one played was my favourite game of the year. What do you mean you haven't heard of Feist? Call yourself a real gamer? But at the same time, a lack of popularity, especially coming out of a big name like Nintendo, tends to come with consequences. Gaming is ultimately a cutthroat business, and if something isn't making as much money as projected and with no improvement in sight, the smart idea is to cut it off. Fire Emblem has its following in Japan and has been pumping out games fairly periodically since 1990, but that doesn't mean that they were selling well. There's a lot of contributing factors to explain why. Fire Emblem might be a historic series of lots of games to its name, but it took Marth and Roy appearing in Super Smash Bros. Melee to convince Nintendo that this kind of series would go down well on the other side of the world. And yeah, these games sold pretty well. Reckon No Ken nearly broke 1 million. But after that, there was a sharp decline due to some iffy timing with future releases. Path of Radiance came out on the GameCube just 6 months before the launch of the Wii, and while Radiant Dawn didn't wait as long with the Wii, it was a hard game on a console that was marketed towards the casual market and didn't really click with consumers. Fire Emblem hasn't been back on a console since. Before Fire Emblem Awakening came out, Nintendo told the team working on it that if sales didn't reach 250,000 copies, then that would be that for the series. It's a hell of an ultimatum, but you can't make diamonds without first applying some pressure. Of course, Fire Emblem Awakening isn't a flawless game, and depending on who you ask, some will say it isn't even all that good, but the improvements that were made helped to raise the profile of the series for a wider audience. The story was presented with a lot more spectacle, character development was given greater focus through building relationships between units, and it came together with tighter gameplay to make one of the most solid strategy RPGs ever made. Naturally, you might be thinking that I'm full of shit, but even if I am, the fact that Fire Emblem Awakening sold close to 2 million copies was enough to keep the franchise alive against all odds is irrefutable proof that without it, Fire Emblem wouldn't have a future. Whether or not you think that Awakening doesn't stack up well against the forced permadeath of older games, or if pairing off units sounds stupid to you, it's still quite important. And now they've got 6 characters in Smash Bros. Quite the turnaround then.
This RabbidLuigi and Fire Emblem Awakening didn't just stave off Nintendo execs who wanted to see the series axed, it provided the perfect platform for the series to grow so well afterwards. Fire Emblem Fates easily outsold Awakening. Fire Emblem Heroes, the mobile game, was downloaded 2 million times in its first day, and following a recent Nintendo Direct, which is entirely based around the franchise, we found out that we're getting 3 more games for the series in the next year or so. Maybe we need more Nintendo IPs to go through this ultimatum. Does anyone know what F-Zero is doing these days?
Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn to a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.